My name is Mai Tan Nguyen. I am 23 years old. The images you are looking at show me packing up my entire life after 4 grueling years of hustling in the city. There isn't much left, just my computer, the only tool I have left to make a living, and a few old clothes neatly folded into a single suitcase. I have decided to give up my rented room, closing a stormy chapter of my youth to return to my hometown. This city was once my ultimate dream. 4 years ago, right after graduating from high school, I packed a bag and stepped out into the world with nothing but my bare hands. My parents had divorced, my family was shattered, and I had no safety net, no financial backing, and no opportunity to pursue higher education like my peers. I had no choice but to throw myself into the workforce, fighting tooth and nail just to survive. Throughout all those years, my income stagnated at a meager 4 to 6 million VND a month, roughly $160, 240. In this expensive city, that money was barely enough to cover rent and 3 basic meals a day. I had to skimp on everything just to get by, let alone dream of a future. But in your early 20s, who doesn't have ambition? Watching the bustling crowds and the dazzling luxury of the city, my heart burned with a desperate desire to change my fate. I didn't want to be trapped in poverty forever. So I gathered all the courage I had left and took a wild gamble to invest in a business. Since my starting capital was absolute zero, I turned to bank loans, mortgaged the last remaining assets I owned, and eventually, out of desperation, fell into the trap of high-interest street lenders. I risked everything on that single bet, hoping for a breakthrough. Then, reality struck with a brutal, unforgiving blow. I failed miserably. In a split second, everything collapsed right before my eyes. I was officially left penniless, buried under a massive debt of nearly 300 million VND, approximately $12,000. The suffocating financial pressure and the relentless daily debt collection calls weighed so heavily on my chest that I could barely breathe. The most painful moment was when, out of absolute desperation, I had to force myself to sell my favorite motorcycle, my most loyal companion that had stuck with me through every street and comforted me during my loneliest nights here. Watching them wheel my beloved bike away, my heart felt completely empty, helpless, and bitter to the point of tears. The absolute pinnacle of my despair came a few nights ago, at 2 a.m. While the entire city was fast asleep and the extravagant lights outside began to fade, I climbed up to the rooftop all by myself. Looking down into the deep, dark void beneath my feet, thinking about the 300 million VND debt, and realizing I was a 23-year-old with no family support, no money and no way out, I stayed awake the entire night. The heavy silence of the dark was like a monster crushing my chest. That night I cried, the silent, breathless tears of a young man standing on the brink of total ruin. But in that darkest hour, a sudden realization hit me. I could not allow myself to keep drowning and slowly dying in this concrete trap anymore. I had to save myself. 100 million VND is a towering mountain, an unbearable weight for a broken 23-year-old boy. But I believe that when you hit rock bottom, the only way left to go is up. I am choosing to go back to my hometown, back to my own family home to raise livestock, grow crops, become self-sufficient, and slowly piece my shattered self back together. For me, returning home is not running away. It is a strategic retreat to rebuild my strength and begin a new, resilient chapter. As long as I am still breathing, I will keep fighting to start over from scratch. These are the very first steps in the journey of Mai Tan Nguyen, starting from a negative balance. The road ahead will undoubtedly be filled with endless hardships and challenges. After spending the entire night awake on the rooftop surrounded by absolute silence, I decided to pack my things and leave the city the very next morning. The motorcycle I rode back home was no longer my own beloved bike. It was generously lent to me by a younger brother, so I could have a means of transportation to work. Carrying a heavy heart full of baggage, I revved the engine and headed straight for the countryside. The moment I set foot at the entrance of my village, the familiar sight of my paternal grandfather and my uncle bending over the fields under the early morning sun caught my eyes. My grandfather is nearly 70 years old now, an age where he should be enjoying his retirement, and his failing strength meant he couldn't assist my uncle much. Seeing that scene, my heart tightened. I pushed aside all my exhaustion, put off all the unpacking and chores, and immediately jumped into the muddy field to lend my uncle a hand. In my rural hometown, the terrain consists mostly of terraced rice fields. Plowing and harrowing here is far more brutal than in the flat plains because the land is steeply sloped, requiring a large, cumbersome agricultural harrowing machine that must still be agile enough to maneuver up and down the terrace steps. That machine is incredibly heavy. Every time you turn it around or try to maintain balance, someone has to forcefully grip and support the handles, which drains a massive amount of physical energy. My uncle and I wrestled in the mud like that from the moment I arrived at 6 a.m. until nearly 10 a.m., finally finishing 3 terraced plots totaling about 3 to 4 sao over 1,000 square meters. At that point, my uncle told me to head back home first to get some rest. To be honest, after 4 years of hustling in the city, being used to sitting in air-conditioned rooms and working in front of a computer screen, abruptly throwing myself into heavy manual labor made my body violently protest. I was so exhausted that I felt faint, my limbs completely weak and trembling. Arriving home, I only had enough strength to quickly rinse off the mud, wait for my sweat to dry and the fatigue to ease a bit, before collapsing onto the bed and falling fast asleep. I couldn't even bring myself to swallow a single grain of rice. That deep, exhausted sleep lasted until afternoon. Right at 3:00 p.m., I forced myself awake and went back to the field with my uncle to finish the last remaining large plot, which was about 2 Iwaisayo, over 700 square meters. Perhaps because of the momentum built up from the morning, my body began to adapt, and my stamina didn't feel as depleted as before. And so, despite having a completely empty stomach because I hadn't eaten anything all day, I braced myself and finished harrowing the field alongside my uncle under the late afternoon sun. It wasn't until twilight began to settle that the two of us finally led the machine. Back home to have our very first meal of the day. A simple meal of pickled greens and braised fish at home after. A long day drenched in sweat tasted incredibly delicious and felt so peaceful. My hands, which used to only be familiar with typing on a keyboard, were now covered in mud and starting to blister. Yet, the sheer exhaustion of hard physical labor somehow made my mind feel lighter. I know the road ahead is long and will be filled with countless hardships, but having pushed through this very first day, I believe I can make it. Watching the heavy harrowing machine churn through each layer of soil, and seeing the sweat of my uncle and grandfather pour into the water, my chest tightens with a hidden pain. My hometown has opened its arms to welcome me back, but deep down, I know I am bringing home a massive burden, an incredibly high price to pay for the naivety of my youth. During my 4 years in the city, the harder I had dreamed of changing my fate, the more painful the crash was when I fell. In the beginning, I poured all my capital into importing fruits from China to sell. The wholesale price over there was cheap, but once it reached Vietnam, due to my lack of business knowledge and poor operational management, I couldn't even sell 1/3 of the stock. The fruit spoiled, leaving me with heavy losses, and I could only salvage a tiny fraction of my initial capital. Refusing to accept defeat, I took another gamble and opened a billiard hall. However, the market competition was brutal, and the sky-high monthly rent in the city put a suffocating strain on me. Because of my weak management capacity, the shop lacked customers, and there were months where I suffered severe negative cash flow. When I could no longer hold on, I had to liquidate the entire billiard hall, walking away with a mere 25 million VND, about $1,000, in hand. Holding that liquidation money, I completely broke down. Lost, depressed, and helpless, I had no idea how to rebuild myself from those ruins. Now, standing in the middle of this countryside field, looking at my grandfather who is nearly 70 years old, my heart is filled with profound regret and fear. The debt of nearly 300 million VND, $12,000 out there, is mostly government-supported loans for young entrepreneurs, and most painfully, bank loans secured by mortgaging the land title to this very property, the only piece of land my grandfather entrusted to me because he believed in his grandson. If I cannot pay off the debt within the next 2 years, his land will be seized and lost to the bank forever. Thinking about that honestly makes me gasp for air. Now that I'm back in the countryside, how am I going to clear this mountain of debt? For the immediate future, I plan to help my family raise chickens, pigs, and ducks to be self-sufficient. To earn money for the monthly interest and principal payments, I intend to apply for manual labor jobs around the area, such as working as a bricklayer's assistant or a cargo porter. The daily wage for a builder's assistant in the countryside now ranges from 300,000 to 500,000 VND, about $12, $20 a day. Although it is grueling physical labor, at least it provides me with a stable and realistic income right now. Facing a bleak and uncertain future, I am deeply hesitant and overwhelmed with doubt. I don't know if my upcoming decisions are right, but Looking at my grandfather's land, I know I don't have the right to give up. As the late afternoon sun slowly dips behind the towering mountains, casting long faded shadows across the terraced fields, the heavy metallic rumble of the harrowing machine finally comes to a halt. My uncle and I wipe the mixed sweat and dried mud from our foreheads, guiding the heavy equipment back toward the small dirt path leading home. My very first day of leaving the bustling city behind to return to my rural roots has finally come to an end, concluding not with grand words, but with a thoroughly exhausted body, muscles that ache with every step, and palms already beginning to blister from the friction of hard labor. Yet, in exchange for this physical toll, my mind feels an indescribable, long-forgotten sense of absolute peace. For the past 4 years, I foolishly chased distant, glittering illusions in the concrete jungle, thinking that wealth and success lay only beneath the flashing neon lights. I ran so hard and so fast, only to trip, break, and realize today that this humble, quiet earth beneath my feet is the only place that genuinely opens its arms to shelter and protect me when the fiercest storms of life hit. But as I look out over the darkened fields, reality quickly sets in. The staggering 300 million VND debt hasn't vanished into thin air. It remains a heavy, invisible shadow looming over me. The 2-year countdown to rescue my grandfather's sacred land from being seized by the bank is ticking away with every passing second. Every tick of the clock is a reminder of my failure, but also a call to fight. I honestly do not know what the winding road ahead holds for me. Whether my crops will thrive or my livestock will survive, but I have made a firm promise to myself. I will document every single step of this raw, unfiltered journey. This will be the true story of a broken 23-year-old boy reclaiming his life through grueling daily manual labor, raising livestock from scratch, working on construction sites as a bricklayer's assistant, and paying off his massive debt, penny by penny. Thank you so much to each and every one of you for being here, for listening to my story, and for choosing to walk alongside Mai Thanh Nguyen through these shaky, uncertain first steps of my new beginning. What will it look like when I finally begin to clean out my old, abandoned family home and invest in my very first flock of poultry and livestock? Will a boy who only knew computer screens survive the harsh reality of farming? I will show you everything in the days to come. Until then, take care, and I will see you all in the next video. Bye for now.